Shiloh has such a impact upon our families, and you see that there's a big picture that was taken in front of Shiloh Church over there around 1913. We're trying to figure out when it went from Shiloh to Mt.Olive. I think I've got it, but I'm not quite sure, but I'm going to give you what I think, and hopefully I can get this thing proved out as to what, and I'll give you my thoughts. So very briefly, I want to talk to you about Shiloh Baptist Church. The road out in front of you that you used to come in here is now called Galloway Road, but it used to be called the old Georgetown Road. That's what it was originally called. It was the post road that led from Boston down to Georgetown, South Carolina, down on into Charleston. And so this was one of the main travel routes at that particular time. The families that were living along this road, right across from us, was the Richmond Galloway farm. And many of you remember when the big barn was here, the road turns into the landfill, and Mr. William King and his family lived there. So as you go down the road, this was the Galloways, then tucked up in there at Clark's Branch was the little road that led up to Joseph Silas Clemmons, who was one of our ancestors. And then there was the Coleman farm, and there was Alfred, and then Dolphus Coleman. You move on farther down the road a little bit where the Clemmonses were located. Go down across Ram's Head Creek, and I think that's what it's called. Am I right? Mm-hmm. Then the McKeithans took over. So that was the families along this road at that particular time, and that's where Shiloh was located. Shiloh was established in 1872. You remember that because that's when Granddaddy Alfred was born. So you've got a good starting point here now as to the time, and you can always think of that. Shiloh started in 1872. Granddaddy Alfred was born in 1872. And the church was established just down the road, about a mile and a half from here, the first building, near the residence of the Colemans, Dolphus Coleman and everything. The first pastor was Reverend A.A. Edwards, Asbury Andrew, and he served from the very beginning until 1890. And so he had a long tenure there as pastor. And then we know that Hartfield S. Robinson was a pastor, and then Reverend Dempsey Lemon Hewitt was a pastor. The way the church is kept in touch were through associational meetings. And so Shiloh was a member of an association, and it seemed like about every year or two they would change. Well, what was happening is there were only about 10 churches in Brunswick County at that time. And so they had to go as far as Robeson County for one associational meeting. And it's interesting to note that when I was reading through these associational minutes that Reverend A.A. Edwards wrote that about the church, they would always have a statement in there that they would say about the condition of the church. He said, all in peace. So that was nice to know that things were probably getting along pretty well. At that time, they had a membership of 25. Interestingly, there was always more women than men, more females than males whenever they reported the number in attendance. But so when it started out, there was about 25. And Reverend Edwards also was the first pastor of my church, Prospect. And he stayed there 2 years. And so that's how we got together. In 1893, associational meeting was up at Soldier Bay, which is in the Ash area. And during that meeting, the finance committee received $1.80. And this was paid to Reverend D.L. Hewitt, pastor of Shiloh Baptist Church. The reason being was that at that meeting, they recommended that all the churches help Shiloh sustain their pastor, as many of that church member are paupers of the county and living at the home of the aged and infirmed of the county. It was more commonly called the poorhouse. And so that was some of the congregation coming from there. The best that we could figure out, the county home was located just beyond Clark's Branch up in the field, and it was called Coleman's Field. And so it was obvious that that's where they could get some of their members to come and attend. Interestingly, when I was looking at my minutes of Prospect Church, it says that we were formed in 1893, a little later, but there was a motion made that the money that Sister O.H. Clemmons and Sister Alice Clemmons collected be paid over to the Executive Committee for the Relief of Shiloh. So Prospect and Shiloh definitely have connection. Now, I have been able, by looking at associational minutes from every time that Shiloh appeared, and they listed the delegates, the people that would represent. They were always the male members, and whenever they listed them, they would give their first initial and their last name. They didn't know I wanted to know more. And so I had to figure out who were the members. So the ones that I can figure out, of course, Reverend Edwards, he married Margaret Lafayette McKeithen, the daughter of Thomas Eli. He lucked up because I think Thomas Eli owned that place there where the church is located, where the Holdens now did own, and so it was pretty obvious. Also, I found a reference that Reverend Edwards was taking care of the meal for his father-in-law. So I think there's a connection there. So we had that. Also, there was a J. Stanlin. Couldn't figure that one out. But this past week, I had an interesting conversation with a man trying to find out something about a Joseph Stanlin over at Lennon's, that married into the Lennon family over at Lennon's Crossroad. Maybe, I can't prove that one. The Flowerses, the Colemans, of course, Alfred, and we know how the Colemans and the Flowers all fit in together. That was Grandma Jenny's line. So they were members there. Alfred Coleman, of course, Granddaddy Alfred, and I'm sure if he was a member that Grandma Jenny was also. There were some Atkinsons that were members, Benjamin Berry Atkinson and a lot of his family. And then it was listed that Bessie Clemmons, who later goes on to marry Peyton, I saw her name appear in some. So I've been able to establish right many of the original members of the church. You remember I told you about the poorhouse, the paupers? Well, there was about 11 that was listed in the 1880 censuses, and trying to figure out some of those. There was a Brown a man and his wife, Harmon and Elizabeth Brown from Town Creek. They were there. But the ones it's interesting that they listed the ones that they were blind or idiotic. And so at that time, that's the way the census taker wrote down the people that were there. Then I received a letter. John Holden lived over in Holden Beach. Massey Holden was his brother, and they grew up there. Their father was Luther Holden, and so the farm came into his possession, and so the Holdens moved there. Interestingly, in that letter, he gives me two people more on the picture. So standing up on the steps of the church, holding the baby, is Ava Holden, and she was holding Roderick. And so now we've been able to add two more names to the list of the people there at the church. And it was through this letter, he wrote his brother Massey, who lived up in Virginia. And he asked him some questions, because I had told him what I wanted him to ask his brother. And so in writing back, he said, yes, that they remember about the old Shiloh church and the Mt.Olive church. So that gave me a clue there, that I knew the time frame was working pretty close as to when it was established. He said that at the time our father and mother moved to the Holden farm, Mt.Olive Baptist Church used the small building as a church house, and so that was a reference there. We know that Mt.Olive, I think, was constituted in 1912, because it goes into the Brunswick Association in 1913, so that tells us that it was established. And I believe that the name changed right around that time when Shiloh sort of faded out, and they changed it over to Mt.Olive. like Anthony said, we waited too late to ask a lot of questions. So young people, get everything you can out of your parents and your grandparents, and so that you'll know what's going on. The best I could figure is the first building was the one right down here at the Coleman's, and that was from 1872 to 1903. The church goes dormant, and then 2 years later, in 1905, they're in the building up on the holding place. This picture over here. And then I think from 1912 to 1914 that Mt.Olive used that old building before it moved over across from Brunswick Community College. So think about it. Here we are, sitting 1.5 miles from the first Shiloh, and about 2 more miles down, perhaps a little further, to get to the holding, what we call holding place. Then from there, Mt.Olive came in and they built on the Richmond Galloway place, which is right here. We go across the road to the old 17, crossing the college. We go beside the college. You come back here, and isn't that something? That we are right back within 1.5 miles of the original church here. So a little bit about Shiloh, and if I find out any more, I'll let you know.